Welcome back to the channel where history is never quite what it seems, where behind every velvet curtain and gold-plated crown lies something deeply disturbing. Today's story is not your usual royal fairy tale. In fact, if you're here for princesses in pink gowns and happily ever afters, you might want to sit this one out. But if you're drawn to the hidden corridors of palaces, where the scent of roses mixes with secrets sealed away for generations, then you're exactly where you should be, because what if I told you that a real-life Princess Anne, heir to unimaginable privilege, spent 13 years trapped in something most of us only associate with death? Not a tower, not a dungeon, but an actual coffin, and not by enemy hands, but by her own family. Now, make yourself comfortable, maybe turn down the lights just a little, and let's go back in time to uncover one of the darkest, most chilling royal secrets ever whispered through the corridors of power. The year was 1722, and the kingdom of Loreto, a once glorious European dynasty now faded from most history books, was ruled by King Thibaut IV, a man of charm in public and cruelty in private. He was the kind of monarch who could inspire loyalty in foreign courts while silently crushing his enemies at home. The palace, with its crystal chandeliers, pristine gardens, and thousand-room expanse, stood like a jewel in the center of a crumbling empire. But behind those polished walls, something festered. Something unspeakable. Princess Serafina was the second daughter of King Thibaut, the Queen Marguerite. Born under a rare eclipse, the midwives whispered that she had the eyes of an old soul, and the court astrologer claimed the heavens trembled slightly the night she came into the world. Her elder sister, Alethea, was the golden child, dutiful, graceful, obedient, but Serafina... she was different. Even as a child, she asked questions no one dared entertain. Why were the palace maids not allowed to look into mirrors? Why were musicians punished if they played a wrong note? Why was her mother always crying behind the chapel doors? She would sneak out of her bed at night, wandering barefoot through the stone corridors, listening to echoes, whispering secrets into the eyes of ancient tapestries. There were stories that, at age 7, she spoke fluent Greek despite never having been taught, and that she once correctly predicted a fire that would later consume the East Wing. But those weren't the things that made the royal court fear. Her daughter was the night of her 13th birthday when everything changed. The celebration was grand, as expected: harpists from the Northlands, exotic fruits from beyond the sea, hundreds of candles lighting up the ballroom, and Serafina, in a silver gown stitched with pearls, looked like a dream half-formed. But the guests spoke in hushed tones. They noticed her eyes lingered too long on portraits that had been covered for generations. They noticed the frost on her wine glass before she touched it. The queen looked pale all night, and the king drank more than usual. At midnight, Serafina collapsed. The physicians blamed a sudden illness. Poison, some whispered, a spell, others insisted. But what's documented, though rarely shown to the public, are the orders given the following morning. Orders not to treat her, not to wake her, not even to speak her name aloud in court. She was to be removed from the guest chambers. She was to be taken to the vault. The royal family had a burial crypt beneath the palace, centuries old, lined with candlelit paths and walls of ancient bones. In a chamber far beneath even that, where the air grew thin and the silence pressed on your skull like a weight, a marble coffin was placed. And inside it, Princess Serafina was laid, but she was not dead. Her breath was slow but present. Her fingers twitched. Some say her eyes flickered open for brief moments as she was lowered into the stone chamber. The coffin wasn't sealed in the traditional sense. It was built with a hidden latch only accessible from the outside. A cruel invention of a paranoid king. Why would a father do such a thing to his daughter? It wasn't rage. It wasn't punishment. In the way one scolds a child, it was fear. The king believed Serafina had been touched by something unholy. There are surviving letters hidden for centuries where Thibaut writes of his daughter's uncanny calm, her knowledge of things no child could know, and how, in his words, she summoned the dead during the lunar prayer. Whether these are the ravings of a guilt-ridden father or the paranoid notes of a ruler unraveling mentally, history doesn't make clear. What is certain is that no record of Serafina appears in the royal ledgers after that night, but legends filled the silence. Servants whispered that they could still hear her breathing through the stone grates in the floor. A guard was said to have gone mad after hearing her sing an ancient lullaby no one had used in generations. A priest, assigned to bless the vault once a month, claimed to see blood weeping from the coffin's hinges. And once, during a particularly brutal storm, the palace dogs gathered near the crypt entrance, whining as if they heard something calling out. The queen stopped appearing in public after that year. Her portrait ceased, her correspondence dwindled. It is believed she would descend into the crypt every few weeks, holding a small lantern, and sit beside the coffin for hours, saying nothing. She left no diaries, no letters, just a final painting, discovered a century later behind a false wall in the West Library. It shows a mother sitting in the dark beside a white coffin, her hand pressed against its side, eyes hollow with guilt. 13 years passed, the world changed. Kingdoms rose and fell, but beneath the palace, in that chamber of silence, the princess remained. And during those 13 years, something happened. No one knows exactly what, because when the coffin was finally opened, she was no longer a girl. That moment, sealed in obscurity and protected by a shroud of rewritten history, would mark one of the most terrifying revelations ever to emerge from royal archives. But that's for another part of this story, because before we open the lid of that coffin, we need to understand how fear becomes tradition, how cruelty can wear the mask of protection, and how even the most beloved bloodlines can turn on their own when power, reputation, and superstition collide. And make no mistake, what Serafina endured inside that stone box is not just a chapter in forgotten history, it's a haunting symbol of how far humans will go to bury what they don't understand. When the coffin was finally opened after 13 silent years, the story didn't end, it became something far worse. That chamber beneath the palace, sealed off from light, sound, and hope, had not just preserved a princess, it had transformed her into a myth, a symbol, and for some an omen. It was the year 1735 when whispers began to rise again within the cracked walls of the Luridian palace. Queen Marguerite had died suddenly in her sleep, her face reportedly frozen in a look of unexplainable terror. Her hand, clasped to her chest, held a worn, rust-colored ribbon, one known to have belonged to Serafina. The queen had kept it hidden in a satchel beneath her pillow for years. When palace staff found it, they trembled, because that ribbon hadn't been seen since the night Serafina collapsed at her birthday ball, the same ribbon she wore in her hair the night the kingdom effectively declared her dead. But now, with the queen gone, there was no one left in the palace to perform the monthly blessings of the crypt, no one to light the candle and sit in silence for an hour beside the marble tomb. And so the ritual stopped. Within weeks, something changed in the palace atmosphere. Staff began refusing to work the night shift. Footsteps echoed in hallways with no visible source. Candles blew out in rooms with no draft. And in the grand gallery, where ancestral paintings lined the walls, the eyes in the portrait of Princess Serafina painted when she was only 12 seemed to shift direction ever so slightly with each passing day, until she was no longer looking forward, but downward, directly toward the crypt below. King Thibaut, now aging and increasingly unstable, ordered the portrait removed. But the servants claimed it reappeared on its own the following morning, nailed back in place with no sign of who had done it. Furious, he commanded it be burned in the courtyard, and so it was, ashes blown to the wind before a crowd of shaking officials. But that very night, the king awoke to find a thin layer of ash coating his chambers, settled across his bed like black snow. Whether these were real events or the product of mass hysteria is impossible to prove, but what came next was documented. The king, now plagued by nightmares of his daughter clawing at the inside of her coffin, finally descended into the crypt for the first time since that night 13 years earlier. Accompanied by 2 guards and a priest, he brought with him a key-rusted mechanism crafted specifically for the coffin's secret latch. No record explains where he had kept it all these years. Some say he wore it on a chain under his robes, pressed always against his heart, The descent took nearly half an hour. The crypt was deeper than most catacombs, far beyond the visible chambers. The air was stale, thick with mildew and silence. When the group arrived at the coffin, it appeared undisturbed. A thin layer of dust veiled the white marble. But the priest noticed something first. The faint outline of fingerprints on the lid. Small, pale, childlike. The king approached, shaking, and inserted the key. The sound of the latch unlocking was said to echo like thunder through the narrow halls. One guard reportedly vomited before the lid even began to shift. And then silence again, no movement, no creaking. Just the slow lifting of the marble slab as it slid slightly open, and inside was Serafina. Alive. But changed. Her skin, almost translucent, shimmered faintly in the lantern light. Her eyes, unblinking, had the glassy stillness of someone who hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. Her hair had grown, matted and wild, wrapping around her like a second burial shroud. But she did not appear starved, nor bruised, nor skeletal. She looked preserved, impossibly so, like a sleeping statue carved from pearl. Then she moved, a single breath. A subtle twitch of the fingers, and the king collapsed. The priest dropped his holy text and fled the crypt, screaming, never to return. To the palace again, the guard stood frozen as Serafina sat up slowly, her eyes scanning the room as if reorienting herself in a world that had long since moved on without her. And she smiled. The king was carried out in silence, unconscious, and pale, his pulse faint. He would die 3 days later without ever regaining full awareness. Some say he muttered her name in his final breath. Others believe he never spoke again after seeing her. But Serafina? She was escorted back to the palace, her return a secret to the rest of the world. Official records state she died at 13. Yet behind closed doors, she walked once more through the corridors that had forgotten her. And wherever she went, silence followed. In the weeks after her return, strange things began happening to those who had participated in her burial. The lead physician who had declared her comatose was found drowned in his own bath, the water filled with white rose petals, Seraphine's favorite flower. A maid who had helped carry her body to the crypt vanished without a trace. A steward was found hanging in the portrait gallery, a message scrawled on the wall in chalk. She watches from the dark. The palace attempted to conceal these events. Of course, royal scribes were silenced, documents destroyed, servants replaced. But rumors spread. Across the countryside, stories began to circulate of a pale woman wandering the palace grounds at dusk, singing in a language no one could understand. Children claimed to see her face in the windows, eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. She never spoke a word, not to the court, not to the staff, not even to her sister, Alethea, who had long since taken over ceremonial duties as the face of the royal house. The reunion between the two sisters, if it ever truly happened, remains undocumented, but there is a single note, written in Alethea's hand, tucked into the margins of an old hymn book. She returned without hunger, without pain, as if the coffin fed her something we'll never name. Eventually, Serafina was moved to a small stone house on the edge of the palace gardens, surrounded by hedges so tall no outsider could see in. No one visited her, no one spoke of her, but the windows of that house were always open, no matter the weather, and from within, music would play strange lullabies that had no origin, melodies that seemed to echo even after they stopped. She lived there for 7 more years. Or perhaps the better word is existed. Then one day, the house was found empty. No signs of struggle, no note, no farewell. Just an empty bed, a perfectly folded gown, and on the pillow her ribbon, placed gently, almost ceremonially, in the exact center. The door was locked from the inside. The royal family announced nothing. Her name was never spoken again in public, but privately, a monument was constructed deep in the palace gardens. A stone pillar etched with no inscription, surrounded by 13 white rose bushes. And if you were to visit that spot today, some say you can still hear humming. Very faint, carried on the breeze, a lullaby, sung by a voice that never truly aged. By now, if you're still here, it means you've already crossed the line, the one that separates historical fact from the haunted echo of what history chooses to forget. Because the story of Princess Serafina isn't just a tale of cruelty, confinement, and superstition, it's a disturbing mirror into the soul of a kingdom that feared what it couldn't understand. And as we push deeper into the folds of this buried legacy, things only grow darker, because if part 1 was about betrayal, and part 2 was about transformation, then what comes next is about contamination. After Seraphine's disappearance from the garden house, the palace tried to resume normal life. Ceremonies were held, guests were entertained, new portraits were painted, but something had changed and the court couldn't hide it. The palace began to feel hollow, like it had been touched by something unclean. Birds stopped nesting on the palace roofs. Flowers withered before blooming in the queen's courtyard. The walls, once echoing with laughter and music, became strangely quiet, almost as if the building itself was holding its breath. King Thebaud had been dead for 7 years, and the crown now rested on Alethea, Seraphine's sister. Though unprepared and visibly burdened by the throne, Alethea was intelligent, calculating, and deeply spiritual. She instituted reforms, repaired relations with the church, and tried her best to erase her father's darkest legacies. But there was one thing she couldn't erase: the memory of her sister. No one knows what truly passed between them during the months after Serafina emerged from the coffin. There were rumors of private encounters in candlelit rooms, whispered arguments behind locked doors, and even one claim by a court musician that he saw the two sisters standing hand in hand in the crypt one stormy night, staring silently at the empty coffin. What is undeniable is that Alethea became increasingly obsessed with the idea of redemption for the kingdom and for her bloodline. She ordered the entire underground crypt sealed permanently, commissioning a thick iron gate with no internal mechanism, melted from ceremonial swords of fallen generals. The passage to the coffin chamber was bricked shut, and the keys to the gate were split in 3 and given to the kingdom's highest religious orders. In her journal only discovered centuries later, Alethea wrote, "The sins of one life echo into the next. What was opened must now be entombed beyond temptation. But no burial can silence a spirit that has already learned how to wait." Just months after the crypt was sealed, a new wave of unease began to ripple through the palace. Infants born to noble families were reported to sleepwalk. A young maid was found humming lullabies she'd never heard before, her fingernails scratched raw from clawing at the walls in her sleep. One night, the palace bells rang by themselves at precisely midnight, the first time they had done so since Seraphine's 13th birthday. The people whispered again. This time not about the ghost of a princess, but about a curse. A theory began to emerge, quietly at first, then growing louder in the letters between bishops, in the scrolls of alchemists, and in the dreams of the superstitious. Whatever Serafina had become in that coffin, she had not left it behind. The transformation wasn't temporary. It wasn't even physical, it was spiritual. An ancient infection of the soul, and it had taken root in the royal bloodline. There was one account, buried in the locked archives of the Laurentian Royal Church, that told of a secret examination performed on Serafina during her silent years in the garden house. Conducted by a religious scholar, Father Bastien, the account reads more like a horror manuscript than a medical record. It describes her skin as unnaturally smooth, her pupils dilated despite full sunlight, and her pulse inconsistent, sometimes rapid, sometimes completely absent. Most disturbingly, it records an incident in which Serafina reached out and placed her fingers gently on the father's hand, after which he experienced a vision so vivid and terrifying that he tore out his own eyes 3 days later and died. Chanting in a forgotten language, his writings preserved only because they were hidden by his apprentice, sworn of a purity turned inward, a soul denied death, and a heart that beats without God's knowledge. They referred to her not by name, but by a symbol, a white rose with a black stem. That symbol would appear again, almost a decade later, in the diary of a palace servant who had recently discovered she was pregnant. She described dreams of being in a coffin, dreams where she could hear her unborn child whispering lullabies from inside her own body. She drew the symbol in her journal just days before throwing herself from the bell tower, and still, The crown pretended nothing was wrong. Alether, to her credit, did try to contain it. She never married, never bore children. She surrounded herself with religious figures, filled the palace with symbols of purity, and reportedly kept a vial of holy water under her pillow at all times, but even she wasn't immune. In her final years, she descended into reclusive madness, scribbling prayers on the walls of her bedchamber and refusing to look into any mirror or reflective surface. She died whispering her sister's name Seraphina, not with hatred, but with something even more unsettling. Longing. Her death marked the end of direct rule from the Thibault bloodline. The monarchy passed to distant cousins. The family name was changed, portraits were replaced, and the name Seraphina was officially banned from being spoken in the royal court, but her presence remained. In the centuries that followed, the palace changed hands, was abandoned, and even turned into a museum, yet guests frequently reported unease in the West Wing, where the original portrait of Seraphina had once hung. Visitors claimed they could feel someone walking behind them, hear soft breathing in empty rooms, and see fleeting shadows where none should be. One caretaker, working the night shift in the 1920s, recorded in his log that he found a single white rose placed on the cold marble floor just outside the sealed crypt gate. There had been no roses on the property for decades. The following morning, the gates were inspected and, though untouched, there was a thin line of moisture running down the center as if condensation had formed. From within, attempts to study the area with modern equipment have proven unreliable. Cameras malfunction, audio recordings pick up nothing but static, and thermal scanners show heat signatures where no one is present. To this day, the coffin itself remains sealed and untouched. Authorities refuse to allow excavation or investigation, citing structural instability and heritage protection. But those who've researched the legend know the real reason. They're afraid of opening something that took centuries to contain. Because whether Seraphina was cursed, transformed, or something else entirely, one thing is clear: she wasn't alone in that coffin, and the thing that came back in her body might still be waiting. Not for release, but for remembrance. A story forgotten is a story unbound. Some stories fade over time, lost to the dust of forgotten books and ruined cathedrals. But others don't fade, they wait, hidden beneath silence, behind locked doors, under stone and shadow. The tale of Princess Seraphina buried, vanished, forbiddance never really died, and as we reach the final stretch of this haunting history, what remains isn't just about a cursed royal or a haunted palace. It's about the terrifying legacy of denial, because when a kingdom chooses to bury its shame grows teeth after centuries of enforced silence. It was in the mid-1800s that interest in Seraphine's story began to stir again, not among royals or priests, but in a place few would expect, an underground society of medical mystics, philosophers, and early psycho-spiritual scientists called the Hollow Crown Circle. This secret group, operating from hidden salons in Paris and Vienna, claimed to be collecting suppressed histories from royal archives across Europe. They were fascinated by one thing above all: the possibility that the human soul, when pushed to its limits, could mutate. In their stolen reports and unapproved field studies, they often returned to the legend of the princess in the coffin. For them, Seraphina wasn't merely a victim, she was a case study, an anomaly, a proof of concept. One of their recovered documents, dated 1836 and written in Latin, includes diagrams of what they called extended consciousness incubation, a theory that claimed the human mind, when isolated from light, time, and interaction, could fracture into new, unrecognizable layers of awareness. And then came a breakthrough. At least, according to them, a member of the Hollow Crown Circle claimed to have visited the original Luridian Palace ruins, now a partially collapsed museum at the edge of a war-torn province. He returned with a scrap of fabric, half of a gold brooch, and something far more disturbing, a music box. It was rusted, partially shattered, but when turned just once, it played a tune no one recognized. A lullaby composed in no known scale, with notes that seemed slightly wrong, off-key, but still beautiful, unearthly. Later analysis found that the box contained a message etched inside the lid. 13 winters, 13 songs, 13 shadows. It was signed simply S. The music box now sits locked in an anonymous collection at a private estate in Belgium. It is not listed in any official catalog. Access is by invitation only, but this wasn't the last time the name Serafina stirred the surface of historical records. During World War I, a bomb raid on the old Laurentian region uncovered what appeared to be a sealed underground room completely untouched, preserved by layers of rock and debris. Witnesses described a narrow stairwell leading to a chamber lined with mirrors, each one cracked in a way that suggested outward pressure, not time or age. At the center of the room stood a marble slab, similar in design to Seraphine's legendary Coffin. It was empty. The discovery was quickly covered up by military officials. Journalists who attempted to report on the chamber were arrested, their notes confiscated. One soldier, who later fled the region and gave an anonymous interview, claimed he saw carvings on the walls, carvings of a girl's face repeated over and over, with the words "she waits for silence" scratched beneath them. From then on, the official policy of every regime that ruled the region was the same: never open the crypt. They didn't call it superstition. They called it containment. By the time World War II ravaged the continent, the palace was completely inaccessible. Bombing campaigns had collapsed entire sections, and what remained was deemed too unstable for excavation. But local legends persisted. Shepherds and travelers claimed to hear singing coming from beneath the earth during full moons. Children born near the ruins sometimes exhibited strange traits: sensitivity to light, a talent for music despite no training, the ability to speak unknown words in their sleep. A few families quietly relocated without ever giving a reason. And then, for decades, everything went quiet, until 1998, a group of independent documentary filmmakers seeking lost historical sites for an unreleased series called Echoes of Empire ventured into the region with the intent to locate what remained of the Laurentian Palace. 3 of them returned. The fourth, Emilia Devereux, vanished after entering a collapsed tunnel alone during filming. She was never found. Her last recorded words, captured on a body mic, were strange and chilling. "She's not dead, she's dreaming." When the footage was reviewed, one audio engineer claimed to hear a melody in the static, a faint, distorted lullaby buried beneath the wind. The project was cancelled, the tapes quietly shelved, and the filmmakers signed strict NDAs. But Emilia's mother, desperate and grieving, shared some of the audio with a paranormal researcher years later. That researcher has since vanished as well. It would be easy to say this is all coincidence, a string of unconnected events bound together by folklore, exaggeration, and human fascination with the macabre. But there are still things that no one has explained, like how 13 members of the Royal Advisory Council died within months of Seraphine's return, each of them in their sleep, faces frozen in expressionless peace, hands folded across their chests, like how the current royal bloodline of Laurentian, now a ceremonial figurehead in a republic, still avoids naming any daughter Serafina, or how every white rose bush planted within the palace grounds has mysteriously withered within 13 days. And maybe the most unsettling question of all, why the coffin remains sealed. Because despite the endless layers of stone, rituals, and secrecy, those who know the legend believe something else entirely, that the coffin was never meant to contain Serafina. It was meant to contain what she became. And if the seal were ever broken, if some historian or thrill seeker decided to pry open what should remain buried, they might not find a skeleton or an empty slab. They might find something watching, something waiting, a being shaped by darkness, fed by silence, sculpted by the horror of abandonment and the hunger for memory, a voice that learned how to hum to herself in absolute isolation, a princess whose lullaby still echoes through stone. So if you ever find yourself walking the ruins of a forgotten palace, and you hear soft singing where there should be none, do not follow it. Do not answer. Do not hum back. Because some stories don't end. They sleep. And Serafina, she has never stopped dreaming.